The night brings with it a heavy and overwhelming silence. In a crowd, one seems invisible even when surrounded by friends, family, and co-workers. The heart tightens, but the words do not come out. Breathing becomes shallow, and the gaze is lost. You carry a pain that no one knows about, but it exists and slowly consumes the soul. This type of suffering is not a fad. It is an experience that has crossed generations since ancient times and finds expression in texts that have echoed for thousands of years in the Psalms of the Holy Bible. In Psalm 38, we find a confession that does not seek approval, only truthfulness. The psalmist uses strong images. He speaks of open wounds of pain that corrode the body and the soul. He speaks of loneliness and the weight of each step. Each of these expressions reveals a person who tries to stay on his feet even when everything seems to be falling apart. He mentions the lack of friends, the hand that seeks comfort but finds emptiness, a voice that seeks understanding but only hears the echo of its own fear. In this scenario, it is understood that silent suffering grows in the shadows and tends to become an invisible giant. It is clear that pain that is not recognized becomes more threatening because you face the silence alone, and this silence is complicit. Even so, the psalmist does not pretend to be well. He shows how real the pain is, and that opening one's heart before God is not a sign of weakness, but of courage. In each verse, there is a cry that is mixed with faith, because there is still the belief that someone is listening even when he does not say a word out loud. The anguish he shows is raw, intense, and genuine, despite appearing without optimistic statements. The psalmist continues to express the confidence that he is not alone, and that God remains there even if absent in appearance. When reading these words, it may seem like there is no way out, but it is precisely this honesty that steals the power of pain. Darkness loses some of its weight when it is confessed. When you put your feelings out there, the weight is shared, showing who you really are. Accepting that something hurts opens space for change, even if it is timid and slow. The crack in your chest can be the first sign that something new can be born. That silent night ceases to be an airless place because you name what you feel. It doesn't matter if there are no explanations or if your friends don't understand. You gain relief by recognizing that you don't need to wear masks. And although the discomfort persists, there is a thread of hope in the fact that loneliness is recognized in the divine plan. The psalm supports this by pointing to a presence that remains perceptible even without noise. At this point, the narrative shifts from suffering to the natural reaction of those who hear that psalm. The words provoke an internal response, a spark that says, "I can do it too," although it seems impossible to express what is going on inside. But there are still unanswered questions. How do you deal with rejection? What do you do when friends move away? These questions arise because expressing anguish is only the beginning of the journey, and many remain trapped in emotional isolation even after confessing their pain to themselves or to God. Then the reflection advances. It recognizes that pain is not something that can be cured with a magic wand or with prolonged silence. There is no point in pretending to be fine when inside everything is in ruins. The way out is in more than words. An attitude that has a name is needed: prayer, seeking help, honest reflection about oneself, and perhaps support from people who care even without fully understanding. However, recognizing the need for this attitude is already a step that the biblical text inspires. The psalmist does not describe what to do next, nor does he offer ready-made recipes, but he teaches that recognizing pain and taking it to the divine is a gesture of resistance and faith. A gesture of courage that allows us to glimpse a new vision, because even if nothing changes for now, something inside has already been marked. The silence begins to become less threatening because it can no longer grow without being seen. And as these words reverberate in the heart, an invisible bridge is formed between the reader's pain and the psalmist's feelings. This bridge begins an internal movement. Pain ceases to be private and becomes an experience that has a name and a voice, even if only in prayer. That weight that held you down now has a place to rest, even if for a moment. Further on, other voices will emerge, other psalms answering different questions, but now the starting point has been established. At this moment, the tone subtly changes from that oppressive silence to something that carries a gesture of freedom, because bringing this confession to the inner world, even if only to God, already changes the environment around it. The chest that was full of a bomb ready to explode now experiences an almost imperceptible but real opening, welcomed by words that have echoed for more than 2,000 years. And this change, even if small, lights a light that offers continuity and not a definitive end. Psalm 38 opens the door to understanding that pain needs to be spoken, but when words begin to emerge, a new challenge presents itself. It is not just about acknowledging the pain, but also about realizing that it causes a silent distancing of those around you. People's gaze changes, conversations slow down, and the phone that once rang now remains silent for days. The psalmist describes this growing distance in detail. Friends avoid contact, acquaintances act as if they don't see, and even those who once offered support seem to have disappeared. In Psalm 31, this feeling deepens. The psalmist speaks of contempt, of being treated like a broken vase, something that has lost its value. This image is devastating because a broken vase is no longer good for holding anything. It doesn't carry water, it doesn't hold flowers, it just takes up space until it is discarded. This is how many people feel when they face suffering in silence. The world seems to look with indifference or even discomfort at those who can no longer hide the emotional weight they carry. The verses are a direct outburst to the Creator. The psalmist describes his own life as consumed by sadness. His bones ache, his eyes grow weak from crying, and his spirit is exhausted. This is a true portrait of someone who tries to maintain an appearance of normality while everything inside is falling apart. The text does not hold back on words. Suffering is described as a constant shadow, a weight that gives no respite. Even his neighbors keep their distance. His name becomes the subject of gossip, and the people around him seem to expect only the worst. This scenario is painfully familiar to anyone who has ever faced emotional loneliness. There are times when the absence of companionship weighs more heavily than the original pain. It's not just the sadness that hurts, but the perception that others don't want to deal with it. The psalmist puts it bluntly when he says that it is like someone forgotten in the hearts of men. The feeling of invisibility is as real as any physical pain. Yet even in this state of social abandonment, there is a reaction of resistance. The psalmist does not give in completely to despair. Amidst his tears and isolation, he recognizes that the only source of true help remains untouched. There are no men around, but there is still a silent certainty that God hears. The cry is sent to heaven with the hope that an answer will come, even if the waiting time seems endless. The interesting thing at this moment is to realize how emotional suffering changes the perception of everything. The day seems darker, the sounds of the street seem more distant, and even the simplest tasks become enormous challenges. The mind creates scenarios of rejection even when they may not exist. The fear of being abandoned again makes the heart close even more, creating a cycle that is difficult to break. A careful reading of Psalm 31 also reveals an important detail. The psalmist does not try to hide his emotions. There is no mask, no filter. He exposes his shame, his fear, and even his character flaws. He presents himself before God as he is, without embellishments or justifications. This transparency is powerful. It indicates that healing begins when the inner truth is accepted and presented without reservations. Many people carry the burden of trying to appear strong. There is a social expectation that suffering should be discreet, almost invisible, as if crying were a sign of weakness and sadness, something to be resolved in silence within four walls. The psalmist breaks with this logic. He transforms his pain into words and his words into prayer. This attitude creates a break with the logic of loneliness. The voice that previously echoed only inside one's own head now reaches the heavens. As we read through the verses, we realize that the psalmist is not just reporting pain. He is naming feelings, recording in the sacred text the experience of being human in its most vulnerable form. This honesty is what makes the Psalms so relevant even after so many centuries. Those who read them can identify with them because human pain has changed little over time. The scenarios may be different, the faces different, but the feeling of abandonment remains the same. The social context in which the psalm was written was not so different in essence. At that time, anyone seen as weak or cursed suffered exclusion. There was the idea that suffering was a sign of hidden sin or lack of faith. Therefore, the isolation from those around them was even more cruel. It was as if the physical and emotional pain was accompanied by a silent judgment. Today, although with different words and pretexts, society continues to practice this same exclusion. Social networks show constant happiness, creating an unattainable standard of perfect life. Those who deviate from this standard end up isolated, forgotten, silenced. It is in this modern scenario that ancient verses gain new life. They become a mirror that reflects the truth that many try to hide. When looking at Psalm 31, the inevitable conclusion is that emotional isolation is nothing new. It has been part of the human condition since ancient times. But the psalmist offers a way, not an easy way, nor an immediate way, but one that involves sincerity before God. He allows himself to feel everything he is feeling, and in doing so, transforms his pain into a cry that has spanned centuries and continues to resonate to this day. The echo of the words of Psalm 31 lingers in the air as a reminder that pain does not need to be hidden. However, even after acknowledging the anguish and admitting the isolation, there is a feeling that refuses to go away. The mind remains heavy, the chest tight, and the soul restless. There is no immediate response, and the silence around seems to grow even greater. The emptiness that was once emotional now also invades the body and spirit. The anguish does not diminish, it changes form, becoming a constant presence that accompanies every movement, every thought. It is in this state that the verses of Psalm 39 take on an even deeper meaning. The psalmist now describes the inner struggle of someone who chooses to remain silent in front of others. He tries to hold back his words, control his emotions, and keep up appearances. He tries to appear strong, to not cause discomfort, to not show the chaos that lives inside. But the more he remains silent, the more his suffering intensifies. The heart burns, emotions bubble, and there comes a point where silence no longer protects, but hurts. It is like a pressure cooker about to explode. The psalmist then decides to do what seems to be the only possible way out. He addresses his words directly to God, not as a formal request, but as an outburst. He speaks about the brevity of life, about human fragility, about the fact that we are all like a breath, a passing shadow. This recognition of one's own limitations is one of the most human and real moments in all the Psalms. The pain that was once merely emotional now turns into an existential reflection. The psalmist questions the value of life itself. He observes how quickly the days pass, how material possessions are accumulated and then left behind. He realizes that the achievements that once seemed important now have no meaning in the face of the inner suffering. This realization brings a kind of quiet despair, but also a rare opportunity to reevaluate priorities. It is common for the human mind to begin to question everything in moments of prolonged pain. The questions arise one after the other. Why continue? What is the meaning of it all? Is there any reason to move on? These questions are not new. The psalmist faced the same whirlwind of thoughts. He admits that his life is short, that his days are like a vapor that soon dissipates. However, in recognizing this fragility, he does not give in to absolute despair. On the contrary, he uses this realization as an argument to ask for God's mercy. This change in perspective is subtle but significant. The suffering that was once kept silent now turns into prayer. The voice that was trapped in the chest now rises towards the heavens. And even if the divine answer has not yet come, the simple act of speaking already changes the dynamics of suffering. The inner silence begins to give way to words that bring some relief, however small. Psalm 39 shows that even the darkest thoughts can be brought before God. There is no need to hide fear, doubt, or feelings of worthlessness. The psalmist proves that God is not offended by human honesty. On the contrary, he welcomes even the deepest laments. This understanding is essential for those who suffer in silence. Knowing that there is a safe space to express one's pain can be the first step toward healing. As we read these verses, it becomes clear that emotional suffering is a cycle with distinct phases. First comes denial, then acceptance, then isolation, and finally, outburst. Each stage is a step that needs to be faced. The psalmist walks this path with an inspiring frankness. He recognizes that life is too short to be lived in constant silence. He understands that to remain silent before God is to deny oneself the chance to receive comfort. The experience described in the psalm also reveals an important aspect of human nature. There is a limit to how much we can carry alone. No matter how much we try to control, hide, or minimize the pain, there comes a time when the body and soul can no longer bear it. The psalmist describes this breaking point in detail, and in doing so, he validates the feelings of everyone who has been through something similar. In today's daily life, this experience is repeated in many forms. People who are struggling with depression, anxiety, or unresolved trauma often choose silence as an attempt at self-protection. They believe that if they don't talk about what they're feeling, perhaps the pain will go away. But as the psalm makes clear, prolonged silence only increases suffering. By turning his anguish into words, the psalmist sets an example of emotional courage. He shows that there is no shame in admitting one's limits, that talking to God is more than a religious ritual, it is an existential necessity, and that by doing so, even if the pain does not disappear immediately, it loses some of its power. This perception changes the way suffering is viewed, not as an enemy to be feared, but as a reality to be faced with sincerity. The healing process begins this way, with simple, honest, and often tearful words. But it is these words that break the cycle of silence and open space for a new possibility of relief. Even after the intense outburst and deep reflection on the brevity of life, the feeling of emptiness still persists. The psalmist now faces not only the weight of internal pain, but also the impression that God remains silent. The words thrown to the heavens seem to find no response. The restless mind begins to create questions that echo in a space of seemingly no return. There is a silent struggle between faith that tries to resist and reality that insists on showing the opposite. This inner conflict, so present in moments of prolonged suffering, appears in a forceful way in Psalm 77. In it, Asaph gives voice to feelings that many avoid confessing. The text describes sleepless nights, unceasing tears, a soul tired from crying out so much. He refuses to be comforted, and even when he remembers God, his restlessness only increases. The contrast between the memory of God's action in the past and the lack of response in the present causes a pain that goes beyond the physical. The questions arise one after the other, almost like a lament in an accusatory tone. Has God rejected us forever? Has his mercy come to an end? Are his promises no longer valid? Asaph does not mince words. He expresses in a raw and direct way what many feel but do not have the courage to say. Doubt is not a sign of lack of faith, but a natural consequence of a heart that waits for help that seems not to come. This spiritual crisis reveals a little discussed aspect of our walk with God. Faith does not always manifest itself as unshakable certainty. At many times, it expresses itself through questions, tears, and painful silences. Psalm 77 exposes this with disconcerting honesty. The psalmist remembers the works of old, the miracles of the past, but when he looks at the present, all he sees is silence. The human mind tends to seek explanations. In times of prolonged suffering, this search can turn into a cycle of internal accusations. The heart asks if it was something we did wrong, if it was a lack of prayer, if God is punishing us, if heaven has simply closed its doors. Each thought becomes an additional burden, making it even harder to bear the moment. The psalm offers an answer that may seem simple at first glance, but it carries a profound meaning. The psalmist decides to change his focus. He chooses to stop looking only at the present and begins to remember the great works that God has done in the past. He recalls the mighty deeds, the deliverances, the signs of care and protection. This attitude does not eliminate the pain immediately, but it creates a basis for hope. This movement of looking back, remembering God's faithfulness, is not an exercise in nostalgia, but an act of spiritual resistance. In doing so, the psalmist creates a counterpoint to the suffering of the present. He builds within himself a living reminder that today's silence does not nullify yesterday's action, that the absence of a response now does not mean an absence of care. This type of reflection is an invitation for those who face God's silence. It is not about denying suffering, but about finding an emotional anchor that keeps the heart from sinking completely. Asaph shows that it is possible to feel pain, question, and lament, and at the same time keep alive the memory that God has already responded in the past. This approach breaks the idea that faith is a straight line, without ups and downs. The psalm reveals that the spiritual journey includes moments of intense doubts, long nights, and questions without clear answers. but it also shows that the memory of previous experiences can function as an emotional support for the days when everything seems lost. God's silence does not mean disinterest. It can be a space where new understandings are born, a time of spiritual maturation that only becomes evident after the storm has passed. Psalm 77 ends with a reminder of God's deeds, especially during the exodus of the people of Israel. Asaph recalls the crossing of the Red Sea, God's care in critical moments, and protection in the face of the impossible. This ending does not provide the answer the psalmist wanted for the present moment, but it does offer a powerful reminder. The same God who acted in the past is still the same today. Even if silence remains, there is a record of faithfulness that cannot be ignored. This process of remembering is a practical tool for those who suffer in silence. Writing in a notebook, talking to someone you trust, or simply closing your eyes and reliving moments when God answered clearly can be a start. It doesn't solve everything immediately, but it prevents the pain from becoming absolute. The experience described by Asaph points to the need to create internal spaces of spiritual memory. When the present seems hopeless, the past can function as a bridge that connects the current pain to the hope of better days. This choice to remember is a conscious decision, an act of faith in the midst of despair. A careful reading of this psalm reinforces the idea that God supports our doubts, welcomes our questions, and remains present even when He seems absent. The suffering soul finds in this a reason to continue, even if it is just for one more day, one more prayer, one more attempt to hope. While memories of God's past actions offer some comfort, the present pain continues to throb with force. The divine silence has not yet been broken, and the inner anguish does not subside so easily. It is in this scenario that an almost instinctive movement arises in the heart of the one who suffers, the desperate cry. The soul that previously remained silent out of fear or shame now finds itself forced to speak, not by choice, but by necessity. Suffering reaches a point where keeping everything to oneself becomes unbearable. Psalm 25 presents itself as the expression of this cry. There is no room for formalities. The words arise from the urgency of a heart that can no longer bear its own weight. The psalmist begins with a direct declaration of trust, but soon delves into requests that reveal the emotional and spiritual fragility of someone who feels lost. He asks for guidance, begs for forgiveness, and implores deliverance. There is no tone of self-justification, just the sincere expression of someone who recognizes that he needs help. This attitude of recognizing one's own limitations is one of the greatest challenges for those who suffer in silence. For a long time, the attempt is to maintain control, not show weakness, and hide the most visible signs of pain. However, there comes a time when there is no longer any choice. The cry emerges as a cry from the soul, a request that breaks through all layers of pride and reaches God without filters. The psalmist speaks of paths, of pathways, of direction. He does not ask for just momentary relief, but for a new route for life. Suffering in silence generates confusion, jumbles thoughts, and distorts perceptions. Therefore, the request for guidance takes on an even deeper meaning. It is not just a request for answers, but for a direction, a reference that helps to reorganize the inner chaos. The request for forgiveness also reveals an important aspect of this process. Often, those who suffer in silence carry accumulated guilt. Guilt for feeling weak, for not having enough faith, for not being able to overcome the pain alone. The psalmist recognizes his faults, but does not dwell on them. He presents them to God with the confidence that there is enough grace to cover them. This surrender is liberating. Admitting that you made a mistake, that you need mercy, that you cannot go it alone is an essential step in any healing process. The biblical text also shows that the cry is not only about abstract spiritual issues. The psalmist speaks of enemies, concrete dangers, and external situations that threaten his integrity. This mixture of internal and external conflicts is a reality for those who suffer in silence. Emotional pain is often combined with social pressures, family problems, financial difficulties, and other factors that make the suffering even more complex. Psalm 25 also presents an element that deserves attention, the remembrance of God's goodness and faithfulness. Even in the midst of pain, the psalmist insists on remembering that God is good and righteous. This choice to focus on God's character acts as an emotional anchor. When everything seems to be falling apart, when feelings offer no security, God's unchanging character becomes the only fixed point in the midst of chaos. The request for protection from shame also appears in the verses. The psalmist fears being humiliated, fears that his trust in God will not be rewarded. This fear is understandable. Those who decide to open their hearts and expose their pain before God face the emotional risk of not being heard. There is the fear that the answer will never come, that the silence will continue, that the situation will get worse. Even so, the psalmist chooses to trust. This trust is not blind or irrational. It is built on the history of a God who has already shown care on other occasions. The psalm ends with a comprehensive plea. The psalmist prays not only for himself, but for all of God's people. This broadening of focus is significant. When pain is so great, it is common to focus only on one's own reality. But by including others in his prayer, the psalmist demonstrates that empathy and compassion can flourish even in the midst of suffering. This act of intercession broadens perspective and helps to lessen the burden of individual pain. This attitude of intercessory prayer also works as a form of emotional healing. By remembering that other people are also facing difficulties, the heart finds space for renewed hope. Suffering ceases to be a solitary prison and becomes a link of connection with others who are going through similar situations. The desperate cry described in Psalm 25 offers no guarantee of an immediate solution. The text does not end with a visible answer or a change of scenery. But there is an important transformation within the psalmist. He begins the psalm with a broken heart and ends it with renewed faith in God's mercy. This internal shift is a powerful reminder for those who suffer in silence. Healing may not come instantly, but the simple act of putting into words what was previously bottled up already represents a step forward. Sincere outcry breaks the cycle of silence and opens space for a new stage in the emotional and spiritual journey. After each layer of pain, loneliness, doubt, and clamor has been exposed, an insight begins to form almost imperceptibly. It is not a sudden turning of the page, but a slow movement, a breath of relief that penetrates the fissures opened by prolonged suffering. The heart that had previously known only silence and anguish begins to feel something different, a subtle hope that does not completely eliminate the pain, but offers a new kind of resilience. It is at this point that the words of Psalm 107 take center stage in the journey. Verse 12 presents a strong and direct image. God, seeing the stubbornness and distance of the people, allowed them to stumble and find no one to help them. The most striking detail is precisely this: there was no one to help them. This lack of help was not the result of human abandonment alone, but of a process permitted by God to provoke an awakening. Reading this passage brings to light a reality that is often difficult to accept. There are times when the absence of answers, divine silence, and even the feeling of helplessness are part of a pedagogical and spiritual process, not to punish, but to teach, strengthen, and redirect. This understanding does not nullify the pain, but gives it a purpose. Throughout the Psalms explored so far, it has become clear that silent pain has many faces. It presents itself as loneliness, as abandonment, as a crisis of faith, as existential anguish, and as despair. Now, at this final point in the journey, it also reveals its role as a tool for a reunion with the divine. When there was no longer the strength to get up, when friends disappeared, when tears dried, the only direction left was to look up. The following verse of Psalm 107 confirms this dynamic. In the midst of oppression, when the weight of the situation seemed unbearable, the people cried out to the Lord in their anguish, and God heard them. Not because they deserved it, not because they did everything right, but because God's mercy manifests itself precisely at times when human beings reach their limit. This revelation brings a different relief than that expected at the beginning of the journey. It is not the promise that all problems will disappear, but the certainty that there is real help, which manifests itself at the right time and in the way that God deems best. The silent suffering was not ignored. It was seen, heard, and recorded. The cry that seemed to echo in the void actually reached the divine throne. This understanding is not just theoretical, it needs to be internalized by those who face emotional pain today. Knowing that God hears even what is not said in words transforms the way in which suffering is faced. Every tear, every thought of giving up, every sleepless night was noted. God's silence was never indifference. It was part of a process that, although painful, points to restoration. Another important aspect that emerges at this moment of reflection is the change in perspective regarding suffering itself. What once seemed like just a punishment or an injustice now begins to be seen as fertile ground for spiritual growth. It is not about romanticizing pain, but about recognizing that it also teaches us. It teaches us about human limitations, about the need to depend on God, about the importance of not keeping everything to ourselves. The psalmist, who once saw himself as a broken vessel, now realizes that even with the cracks, he can still be useful. He can still carry a little hope. He can still be a living testimony that it is possible to survive the darkest days. Pain leaves marks, but it also creates scars that speak of overcoming. It is important to remember that this process does not follow a predictable schedule. Each person will have their own time, their own rhythm. For some, the answer will come quickly. For others, the wait will be long. But Psalm 107 confirms that God hears, He sees, and, at the right time, He acts. This understanding ends the journey with an invitation to continue. Silent suffering needs to find a way out, and this way out begins with the courage to speak, to expose, to cry out. Even if the words are few, even if the voice fails, the simple act of seeking God already represents a change of course. The experience of the psalmists throughout these texts leaves a clear legacy. There is no pain that goes unnoticed in the eyes of God. There is no tear that goes unnoticed. And even the deepest silence carries within it a cry for help that heaven is capable of hearing. Therefore, the story of those who suffer in silence does not end with a full stop of defeat, but with a comma of hope. The path ahead may be long, but it will not be walked alone. God remains attentive. The answer will come. And when it does, what is suffering today will be remembered as a milestone of transformation and rebirth. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so that we can continue to bring you more in-depth research and analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps in the growth of the channel and in the production of even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support.